Trump isn't just winning any new friends in the media or in the streets, it seems. A huge crowd joined a women's march against Trump in Washington yesterday, and there was similar protests with big numbers across the U.S., in Canada, and in Europe. More on that in a moment. First, though, here's President Trump speaking at the inauguration about his priority in office.
From this day forward, a new vision will govern our land. From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.
Donald Trump is at his inauguration reciting the mantra for his new administration in Washington. The U.S. president's speech gave warning to the world of a sea change in U.S. international policy, including trade. The White House wasting no time in making it clear again that NAFTA will be reworked or the U.S. will pull out. Now, Justin Trudeau did have a conversation with Trump over the phone yesterday. There were a few specifics from either side on what they talked about.
The president had a constructive conversation with Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada about strengthening the relationship between our two nations. They also discussed setting up additional meetings in the days to come, which we will follow up on. He also spoke to Prime Minister...
No date set to talk things over. The U.S. has not named an ambassador to Canada, even though Bruce Heyman has packed up and gone home. It's time for the Sunday Scrum. Joining me today, freelance columnist Susan Riley, John Ibbitson of the Globe and Mail. They are both in Ottawa. And Maclean's columnist Marty Patrickin joining us live from Montreal this morning. Marty, let me start with you. Is Donald Trump going to hurt us?
Look, after yesterday, I don't... Donald Trump has rendered me as a pundit. You're not supposed to be this. You're not supposed to be speechless. Yesterday, I was speechless. And it speaks to the issue at hand that we're talking here. Look, we are at the whims, the twisted whims and the Twitter feed of this man. Is it going to hurt us? I don't know. Maybe a Canadian will have pissed him off yesterday morning and he's going to go after Canada. That's what we're dealing with. There's no internal logic to any of it. White is black, freedom is slavery. Like, everything is upside down at this point. But as far as, the one area, talk about specifics here, we talked a lot about in the last few weeks about NAFTA, certainly in regards to the manufacturing industry of automobile manufacturing. The thing in that I find interesting is that it's the brands that we're talking about, GM, Ford, Chrysler. They're more than brands. They're sort of examples of American might. So it's very easy for someone like Donald Trump to come in and go, look, these things are American, and it makes sense that they're built in America for Americans, and that's where it can hurt us, because I think that's the biggest worry at this point, outside of everything else that Trump is doing that impacts Canada directly. Yeah,
let me ask you about this. I was talking to CBC business commentator Elmer Kim, and he told me NAFTA is too intricate to pull apart, or at least it won't be easy. But taxes, that's a whole other story. John Ibbitson, your impression of Donald Trump and whether he can hurt us.
He can hurt us. He can hurt the United States. He can hurt the world. Look, we're all in a bit of shock. The inaugural address on Friday was, as Bob Ray put it, the single worst speech ever delivered by a politician in his lifetime. It was a declaration of a trade war with the rest of the planet, that the United States will do whatever it has to do to protect, in the narrowest of definitions, American jobs, America first and America only, and that means whatever it means. And now we're waiting to find out exactly what it means. But at the least, it means some kind of rewriting of NAFTA. It means, for example, Canada having to make an incredibly difficult moral choice. Do we, if Donald Trump simply abrogates the North American Free Trade Agreement and throws up a tariff wall with Mexico, do we throw the Mexicans under the bus? because we're part of that agreement. It's an agreement between 3 different countries. Do we just let the Mexicans suffer while we try to do side deals and back channel arrangements to protect Canadian jobs?
Yeah.
Or do we stand with the Mexicans and say, we will defend this trade agreement, whatever it takes? That itself is just a horribly difficult decision for any prime minister to make. Is your first interest Canadian workers' jobs, or is your first interest the protection of internationally binding trade agreements? And from there, it just gets worse.
Okay, Susan, what do you think?
Well, I don't think it's any contest. I think the first job of any prime minister would be to protect Canadian workers' jobs. I'm a bit like Marty. In fact, in some ways, I get less concerned about Trump the more I hear him, because what he says is completely disconnected from what he might be saying or thinking the next day, and certainly it's hard to draw a direct line between what he says and what he does. So my sense, and just judging how he's been so far, is that we could be wounded. Specific Canadian companies, specific Canadian communities could be wounded by some pro-America impulse on Trump's part. But I don't think he has the sustained attention to throw the whole NAFTA deal out the window, to entirely disrupt trade. We've made the point before that there are winners in this relationship between Canada and the U.S. on both sides of the borders. That's the note that the Canadian government officials are constantly sounding. So yes, he could do damage, but I don't think it was necessarily going to be devastating. It depends on how long he really concentrates on this. But I do think the first victim of the new administration is going to be that softwood lumber deal. But let's just, for historical context, say we've always been on our back foot on that deal, whether it was Bill Clinton, George Bush, or even Obama. That's always going to be an irritant.
Okay, I get where some people think that we don't mean much to the United States. We've discussed that before. It's Mexico thereafter, et cetera. But an empty embassy, no date for a visit, is there something more to that?
I honestly don't think so. After having, again, I go back to what I saw yesterday. I honestly don't think it's anything more than the utter gong show that is Donald Trump's presidency so far. They asked Obama era officials to stay in their positions because they didn't have the might, didn't have the will or whatever. They didn't have the time to hire new people. I think that's an example of this. I don't think it's anything more than that.
Okay, it won't be easy to turn away from a big market so close to us, though. In negotiations, it's always good to have a hammer, a carrot, and a stick. What have we got? I mean, what's that look like when Canada says to other countries in the world, we are open for business? John?
Well, we've got nothing in these negotiations right now.
Nothing.
And that, in a way, it's a
that's
blessing.
not true.
This administration is going to be focusing on 2 countries, Mexico and China, especially China. The focus is entirely negative. It's entirely punitive. That's why Friday's inaugural address was so depressing, why it has so many people around the world genuinely frightened that we're going back to a kind of 1930s Great Depression view of world trade. The Americans are going to launch punitive tariffs of one kind or another against Mexico, one of its largest trading partners, and against China, the world's 2nd largest economy. That's going to have huge global ramifications. It may well lead to a global recession, and Canada will be seriously hit by that. But we will not be key players in these discussions. At best, we will escape because no one will notice us.
Yeah.
At worst, we will be drive-by victims. But either way, it's not up to us. It's the United States, Mexico, and China right now, with all the rest of the world watching.
So don't make eye contact with the beast. Is that what you're saying?
Don't tweet anything, right? Like that's what it comes down to.
But can I also say there are, our two of our biggest exports to the U.S., like softwood lumber. This dispute's been going on for decades, and some Canadian lumber companies have now bought mills in Tennessee. They've essentially jumped the border, and they're trying to protect themselves that way. It doesn't do anything for Canadian jobs, but it keeps some Canadian companies viable.
Yeah.
And when it comes to oil, a lot of the tar sands oil goes down to those refineries in the Gulf, and those refineries in the Gulf states are specifically calibrated to handle heavy oil. So it's not going to be that easy to just simply turn off the tap and find some other product for them to refine and ship. So these are huge, complicated things. To my mind, the threat from Trump is far graver on the climate front when it comes to climate change. He can't 100%. Stop the progress, but his administration sure can put a spoke in the wheels.
Yeah.
And that that to me will be far more devastating than any trade consequences.
They made a few announcements almost right away, and one of them is they're signaling their intention, as they did before, to pull out of these international agreements. But I also want to talk about the millions of people who took part in those women's marches around the world, including here in Toronto. Some are calling this march in Washington historic. Certainly it was, with an estimated 500,000 people packing the streets of the U.S. Capitol. Susan, your thoughts on what happened yesterday, the kind of resistance we're seeing to Donald Trump, and whether it's going to go the way of the Occupy movement?
I think it was a massive expression of revulsion and disgust at Mr. Trump himself, his persona, his values, just the way he is.
Actions.
I don't think it was pardon me?
His actions.
Yeah. I don't think it was about trade specifically. Certainly, there were some people there very concerned about climate and, you know, the threatened rollback of women's rights and minority rights. I found it astonishing, first of all, how closely, especially in Canada, thousands upon thousands of people, women, men, and kids, turned out in cities across the country. It was an incredible expression of the intense nervousness that Canadians feel about our neighbor. When you consider that we have a self-proclaimed feminist as a prime minister, that the rights thing in this country has been moving in an opposite direction towards more rights being honored, it was a really interesting expression of the power of the American, what happens in the States on Canadian psyches.
The other thing too that I find interesting about it is that, you know, it happened literally. It was almost like a knee jerk to what happened the day before in terms of the inauguration, and it sort of, for me, it seems like it's the only way that you can get at this guy. You can get at him through this sort of movement, this sort of physically taking the streets, and also satire. Look, here's a guy that you know, went in front of the intelligence, was at the CIA, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's right, in Langley.
To sort of offer an olive branch to the CIA because he compared them to Nazi Germany 2 weeks before. He literally standing in front of a wall with stars, you know, honoring the people that died in the service for the CIA, and he starts complaining about the nasty news media and the numbers of that were at his inauguration. That's dictator territory, and that is, yes, it's scary, but it's also ripe for satire, and I think that's the only recourse we have at this point.
Do you know what was striking to me about that, though, Marty, everybody, is that when he took to the media, there was a huge round of applause when he called them the dishonest media and that he was at war with the media. A huge round of applause in that room.
Yeah, but don't be deceived by that, Carol. That was not members of the Central Intelligence Agency enthusiastically applauding the president. That was people that he put in the room. You're always going to hear that. You're always going to hear Trump supporters, one might even say Trump enablers, at any gathering
Trump
applauding
employees
enthusiastically, but they're just paid staff who are brought in to applaud. Look, the good news in all of this is that you have a coalition the like of which you've never seen before. You have conservatives and progressives equally bound in opposition to Donald Trump. You have Bill Kristol of the Weekly Standard and Paul Krugman of the New York Times on the same page. Because whether you are on the left or the right, basically, if you're in favor of democracy, then you are opposed to Donald Trump.
And he's throwing them out. He's throwing them out of the White House.
Yeah, and that's the good news, though. The bad news is, what are you going to do about it? Let's remember, the Occupy movement, a total failure. Every attempt of the past 10 or 20 years to produce some kind of populist, or not populist, don't let me use that word ever, sort of ground, you know, groundbreaking, groundswell, grassroots movement of opposition has failed. So what's going to happen?
I don't know. Black Lives Matter.
I don't agree,
it's
John.
a failure.
Here in Canada,
it has not. None of them have succeeded in changing the agenda. What are people going to do
wait,
to
Idle No
confront
More
this
in
agenda?
Canada has had an impact. I would argue
No.
that Idle No More in Canada
Absolutely,
has had
they
an
have
impact.
not.
It's pushed forward. Yes, they have certainly captured the attention of the current government and of Justin Trudeau. And granted, it's been glacial, the progress that they've made so far, but I think it's given that whole issue a profile that it didn't have 5 years ago.
What
so
about
I
that,
disagree.
Look, folks, I couldn't disagree more. This is not about profile. This is not about raising issues. This is about confronting a rogue administration that is a clear and present danger both to democracy in the United States and to peace and order around the world. So what we have to do is find ways to mobilize and to act, left and right together. And don't delude yourself into believing that just marching down the street and waving banners is going to achieve that.
To save the liberal international order, John, I'm shocked.
I'm afraid it's true.